For 23 years, a woman named Hester worked as the head cook at Oakmont Plantation in South Carolina, preparing elaborate meals for the White family and their guests in a kitchen that was positioned just off the main dining room, separated only by a thin door and walls that allowed sound to travel freely between the two spaces. The White family that owned Oakmont, the Hartwell family, discussed everything in that dining room during and after their meals, believing that Hester and the other enslaved servants were either too ignorant to understand what was being said or too powerless to do anything with the information, even if they did understand. They discussed business deals and political schemes. They discussed their affairs and their debts and their plans to sell enslaved people to cover those debts. They discussed crimes they had committed and crimes they were planning. And Hester, standing quietly in the kitchen, just beyond the door, heard every word. What the Hartwells did not know was that Hester was literate, having been taught to read and write secretly by a former owner's daughter before such education became illegal for enslaved people. And what they never suspected was that for the final 3 years, before she escaped in 1858, Hester had been writing down everything she heard, creating a detailed record of the Hartwell family's secrets, crimes, and hypocrisies that she smuggled north with her when she fled, and that she eventually published as a manuscript that destroyed the family's reputation and provided historians with an unprecedented insider view of slavery's operation. Before we descend into Hester's story and the devastating secrets she documented, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we recover the testimonies that slavery tried to silence. Hester was born enslaved around 1815 on a small plantation in Virginia, and her early childhood involved the typical instability and trauma that characterized enslaved people's lives: family separations, sales between owners, and the constant awareness that nothing was permanent, and that the people who controlled her life could change her circumstances at any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all. Around 1825, when Hester was approximately 10 years old, she was sold to a family named Morrison, who owned a medium-sized plantation in coastal South Carolina. The Morrison family had a daughter named Catherine, who was about the same age as Hester, and Catherine, for reasons that were never fully explained, but that may have involved genuine affection or simply a child's rebellion against adult rules, decided to teach Hester to read and write. The lessons occurred in secret because South Carolina law prohibited teaching enslaved people literacy, and both girls understood that discovery would result in severe punishment for Hester and disgrace for Catherine. Over approximately 2 years, Catherine taught Hester to read using the Bible and other books from the Morrison family library, and she taught her to write using slate and chalk that they concealed after each lesson. By 1827, when both girls were about 12 years old, Hester could read at a level comparable to educated white children, and could write well enough to compose letters and to document her thoughts and observations. The literacy that Hester acquired through Catherine's secret lessons was dangerous and valuable in equal measure. It was dangerous because discovery would have resulted in brutal punishment designed to make an example of her and to deter other enslaved people from seeking education. It was valuable because it gave Hester access to knowledge and to forms of resistance that were unavailable to most enslaved people, and because it would eventually allow her to document the Hartwell family's secrets in ways that would survive to inform future generations. But the immediate effect of Hester's literacy was simply that she had to hide it completely, never revealing to anyone except Catherine that she could read or write, and maintaining this secret even after Catherine married and left the Morrison household when both women were in their late teens. Hester's ability to read meant that she understood written documents that she encountered while working in the plantation house, including letters that family members received and account books that documented the plantation's finances. She understood newspaper articles that family members read aloud or discussed. She understood the contracts and legal documents that appeared occasionally when the family was conducting business. And crucially, she understood that the conversations she overheard had significance beyond their immediate context, and that recording them might someday be valuable. In 1835, when Hester was approximately 20 years old, she was sold again, this time to the Hartwell family who owned Oakmont Plantation near Charleston. The sale separated her from the Morrison family, where she had lived for a decade, and where Catherine had been her secret ally and protector, and it placed her in a new household where she would have to establish herself, and where the conditions and treatment might be better or worse than what she had experienced previously. The Hartwells were a wealthy family who had made their fortune through rice and cotton cultivation, using the labor of approximately 200 enslaved people, and they lived in a style that emphasized luxury and social status. The plantation house at Oakmont was a massive Greek Revival mansion with elaborate furnishings and decorations, designed to impress visitors and to demonstrate the family's wealth and refinement. The Hartwells entertained frequently, hosting dinners and parties where Charleston's elite would gather to eat, drink, and discuss politics and business. Hester's role at Oakmont was to serve as head cook, responsible for preparing the elaborate multi-course meals that the family and their guests expected, supervising other enslaved people who worked in the kitchen, and maintaining the standards of food quality and presentation that the Hartwells demanded. The physical layout of Oakmont's kitchen and dining room was crucial to how Hester would eventually be able to document the family's secrets. The kitchen was a separate building in many plantation houses, isolated from the main house to reduce fire risk and to keep cooking heat and smells away from living spaces. But at Oakmont, the kitchen had been built as part of the main house during renovations in the 1820s, positioned just off the formal dining room, with only a door and thin walls separating the two spaces. This arrangement was convenient for serving meals, because food could be brought from kitchen to dining room in seconds, rather than being carried across a yard from a separate building, and it allowed the family to call for the cook or servants easily if they wanted something. But it also meant that conversations in the dining room were easily audible in the kitchen, particularly when the family was drinking and became loud, or when they forgot to lower their voices while discussing sensitive topics. The Hartwells apparently never considered that this arrangement might allow enslaved servants to overhear private conversations, or they simply did not care because they assumed that enslaved people were too ignorant to understand complex discussions or too powerless to use any information they might accidentally obtain. For the first 20 years that Hester worked at Oakmont, from 1835 through 1855, she overheard countless conversations, but did not systematically record them beyond remembering details that seemed important or interesting. She heard the Hartwells discussing business deals with other plantation owners, negotiations about buying and selling enslaved people, complaints about debts and financial problems, and plans for acquiring more land or for expanding their operations. She heard them discussing their children's marriages and educations, their social ambitions, and their frustrations with other elite families. She heard Thomas Hartwell, the patriarch, discussing his extramarital affairs with enslaved women on the plantation and his strategies for concealing these relationships from his wife Eleanor. She heard Eleanor Hartwell discussing her own secrets, including financial arrangements she was making without her husband's knowledge, and her plans for ensuring that her favorite son would inherit the largest share of the plantation despite not being the eldest. Hester absorbed all this information, storing it in memory, and occasionally sharing particularly significant details with other enslaved people in the quarters when such sharing seemed safe and useful. But she did not yet begin the systematic documentation that would make her testimony unique and historically valuable. The catalyst that transformed Hester from a passive listener into an active documenter was a conversation she overheard in November 1855 about the Hartwells. Plans to sell approximately 30 enslaved people to cover debts that Thomas had accumulated through bad investments and gambling losses. The conversation was particularly disturbing because the people being sold included families with young children, and the Hartwells were discussing deliberately separating children from parents. because separated individuals sold for less than families, and because the point was to raise money quickly rather than to preserve family bonds that the Hartwells did not value. Hester heard Thomas and Eleanor debating which families to break up and which individuals to keep, making calculations about financial value with complete indifference to the human suffering their decisions would create. One of the families being discussed included a woman named Sarah, who Hester had known for years and who had 3 young children. And Hester heard Thomas say explicitly that they would sell Sarah but keep the children because Sarah was older and less valuable, while the children would become more valuable as they grew and could be sold later for higher prices. The casual cruelty and the calculating nature of this discussion outraged Hester in ways that previous overheard conversations had not, and she decided that the secrets and crimes she was hearing needed to be documented and preserved and eventually made public. Beginning in December 1855, Hester started writing down everything significant that she heard in the dining room, creating a secret record that she maintained for the next 3 years until her escape in 1858. The mechanics of this documentation were difficult and dangerous because Hester had to obtain writing materials without arousing suspicion, had to find time and privacy to write without being observed, and had to conceal the growing manuscript in places where it would not be discovered during searches or routine activities. She acquired paper by carefully taking single sheets from supplies that the Hartwell family kept for correspondence, never taking enough at once to be noticed, but accumulating paper over time. She made ink from berries and other materials that were available in the kitchen and that could be explained as cooking supplies if questioned. She wrote primarily at night in the cabin she shared with 2 other enslaved women, working by dim candlelight and hiding the pages as she completed them in a space she had created beneath the cabin's floorboards. The women she lived with knew what she was doing and actively helped her by keeping watch and by providing cover if anyone approached while she was writing, demonstrating the solidarity and mutual protection that often characterized relationships among enslaved people who recognized their shared interests in resisting the system that oppressed them. A content of Hester's manuscript, portions of which survived and were eventually published after her escape, provided extraordinary detail about the Hartwell family's private lives and about how slavery functioned from the perspective of someone who observed the masters intimately, but who had every reason to record the truth rather than to maintain the fictions that the family wanted to believe about themselves. Hester documented Thomas Hartwell's serial sexual exploitation of enslaved women on the plantation, naming specific women and describing how Thomas used his absolute power to coerce them into relationships they could not refuse, regardless of whether they had husbands or partners among the enslaved population. She documented the resulting mixed-race children who were legally enslaved despite having Thomas as their biological father. And she recorded Thomas and Eleanor's discussions about how to handle these children, including plans to sell them away to distant locations where their parentage would not be obvious. She documented Eleanor's awareness of her husband's behavior and her choice to blame the enslaved women rather than holding Thomas accountable, describing conversations where Eleanor called the women degrading names and planned punishments for them for seducing her husband, even though everyone, including Eleanor, understood that enslaved women had no power to refuse their owners' demands. Hester also documented the Hartwells' business dealings and financial manipulations, recording conversations about fraudulent practices, about bribing officials, and about using their political connections to avoid consequences for illegal actions. She documented Thomas's gambling debts, which were substantial, and which were driving the family toward financial crisis despite their outward appearance of wealth and stability. She recorded discussions about plans to default on loans while hiding assets through shell transactions with relatives and associates. She documented the family's involvement in the illegal international slave trade, which had been banned since 1808, but which continued through smuggling operations that brought enslaved Africans to the United States and sold them at high prices to plantation owners willing to pay premiums for new workers. Thomas Hartwell was apparently investing in such smuggling operations as a business venture, and Hester overheard multiple conversations about ships arriving with human cargo and about the profits being distributed among the investors. This illegal activity was particularly significant because it demonstrated the continuing connection between American slavery and the African slave trade, decades after such trade was supposed to have ended, and because it showed that supposedly respectable elite families were actively participating in and profiting from international crimes. Perhaps most devastatingly, Hester documented the Hartwells' complete hypocrisy about slavery and morality, recording conversations where they privately acknowledged that slavery was unjust and indefensible, even while they publicly claimed it was a benevolent institution that benefited enslaved people. She recorded Thomas saying explicitly during an 1857 dinner conversation that we all know that slavery is nothing more than theft of labor, and that all our fine rhetoric about civilizing the Africans is pure invention to soothe our consciences. But what alternative do we have when our entire economy depends on free labor, and when freeing our Negroes would impoverish us? This admission, written down by Hester within hours of hearing it, directly contradicted the public position that the Hartwells and other slaveholders promoted through political speeches, newspaper articles, and religious sermons claiming that slavery was justified by racial difference and by the supposed benefits it provided to enslaved people. The manuscript documented many similar admissions where the Hartwells acknowledged in private that their public justifications for slavery were lies they told to maintain social and political support for an institution they knew was fundamentally unjust, but that they were unwilling to give up because it benefited them financially. The planning and execution of Hester's escape in August 1858 required careful preparation because she needed to not only free herself, but also to preserve and transport the manuscript she had created over the previous 3 years. Hester had maintained secret contact with free black people in Charleston, who were part of networks that helped enslaved people escape. And through these contacts, she had arranged for assistance in reaching Pennsylvania, where she would be free. The escape was planned for late August, when the Hartwells would be away from the plantation visiting relatives, and when supervision of enslaved people would be slightly relaxed. Hester prepared by gathering the manuscript pages from their hiding places, binding them carefully, and creating a waterproof wrapping that would protect them during travel. She also prepared letters to specific people, including abolitionists in the North, who she hoped would help her publish the manuscript and use it to expose slavery's realities. On the night of August 22, 1858, Hester left Oakmont Plantation, carrying only a small bag that contained the manuscript, some food, and a change of clothes, and she traveled by foot and by boat through networks of safe houses to Charleston, where free black allies hid her until she could be transported north by ship. The journey from Charleston to Philadelphia took approximately 3 weeks and involved multiple close calls with authorities searching for escaped enslaved people. But Hester successfully reached Pennsylvania in mid-September 1858 with the manuscript intact. Once in Philadelphia, she made contact with abolitionists, including members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, who were interested in publishing first-hand accounts by formerly enslaved people that documented slavery's realities. Hester's manuscript was extraordinary, both because of the detailed information it contained about a specific wealthy family's secrets and crimes, and because it demonstrated that enslaved people were carefully observing their masters and recording their hypocrisies and violations, even when the masters believed they were unobserved. The abolitionists recognized the manuscript's potential value for anti-slavery advocacy and began preparing it for publication, while also helping Hester establish herself in Philadelphia's free black community, where she could build a new life. The publication of Hester's manuscript occurred in stages beginning in early 1859, when excerpts appeared in abolitionist newspapers, including The Liberator, and continuing through 1860, when a fuller version was published as a book titled 23 Years in the Kitchen. A Cook's Record of a South Carolina Family's Secrets. The publication created a sensation and a scandal. Abolitionists praised it as powerful evidence of slavery's corruption and of enslaved people's intelligence and capability. Southern slaveholders and their defenders condemned it as lies and propaganda, claiming that Hester could not have written such a document because enslaved people were illiterate and incapable of the sophisticated observations the manuscript demonstrated. The Hartwell family specifically denounced the manuscript as completely fabricated and threatened legal action against the publishers, though they never followed through on these threats, probably because a trial would have required them to address specific accusations in the manuscript that they preferred to simply deny and ignore. The controversy over the manuscript's authenticity and its political implications continued for years, with supporters and critics debating whether it was a genuine document or was an abolitionist fabrication, using Hester as a supposed author to give it credibility. The question of authenticity was not definitively resolved during Hester's lifetime, but subsequent historical research has confirmed that the manuscript is genuine and that Hester did write it based on her years of observations at Oakmont Plantation. Evidence for authenticity includes the detailed specificity of the information in the manuscript, which included names, dates, and descriptions of events that could be verified through other sources. The consistency of the writing style throughout the manuscript, which suggested a single author, and testimony from people who knew Hester and who confirmed that she was literate and that she had described her documentation work before publishing it. Additionally, some of the Hartwell family's private papers that survived into the 20th century, and that were eventually examined by historians, contained information that corroborated specific claims in Hester's manuscript, including references to business dealings, family conflicts, and financial problems that matched what Hester had described. While it is possible that some details in the published version were edited or elaborated by abolitionist editors, the core content appears to be authentically Hester's work based on her actual observations. The impact of Hester's manuscript on the abolitionist movement and on public understanding of slavery was significant, though difficult to measure precisely. The manuscript provided ammunition for abolitionists, arguing that slavery corrupted slaveholders morally and that the institution was maintained through lies and hypocrisy rather than through genuine belief in its justness. It demonstrated that enslaved people were intelligent observers who understood exactly what was being done to them and who documented their oppressors' crimes when possible. And it showed that the supposedly refined and respectable elite families who claimed to practice slavery benevolently were actually engaged in sexual exploitation, family separation, fraud, and illegal slave trading, while privately acknowledging that their public justifications for slavery were lies. These revelations were used in abolitionist speeches, writings, and organizing to challenge pro-slavery arguments and to build support for ending the institution. Whether the manuscript changed anyone's mind about slavery who was not already opposed to it is uncertain, but it certainly strengthened the resolve of abolitionists and provided them with powerful specific examples to cite in their advocacy. Hester's life after publishing her manuscript was lived quietly in Philadelphia, where she worked as a cook and seamstress, and where she married a free black man and raised a family. She gave occasional speeches about her experiences at abolitionist gatherings, but she largely avoided public attention and focused on building a stable life free from slavery. She apparently maintained her literacy and continued writing throughout her life, including letters to former enslaved people she had known and to abolitionists she had worked with, though most of this correspondence has been lost. Hester died in 1882 at approximately 67 years old, having lived 24 years as a free woman after 23 years of observing and documenting the Hartwell family's secrets while enslaved. Her manuscript remained in print periodically throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though it was often dismissed by historians who were skeptical of enslaved people's testimonies or who preferred sources created by white observers. The manuscript's rehabilitation as a serious historical source occurred in the late 20th century, when scholars studying slavery began taking enslaved people's testimonies more seriously and began recognizing their value as insider perspectives that revealed aspects of slavery that external observers could not document. The broader significance of Hester's manuscript extends beyond its specific content, too. What it reveals about the hidden resistance and documentation that enslaved people engaged in despite enormous risks and constraints. Hester was not the only enslaved person who was literate despite laws prohibiting such education, and she was not the only one who observed her masters carefully, and who understood that the conversations and behaviors she witnessed contradicted the public narratives about slavery being justified and benevolent. But she was one of relatively few who managed to document her observations systematically, and to preserve that documentation through escape and publication. Her manuscript represents countless stories that were never written down, or that were written down but were lost or destroyed. Stories of enslaved people who understood exactly what was being done to them and who documented it when they could. The fact that Hester succeeded in creating and preserving her record demonstrates that such documentation was possible even under the severe constraints of slavery, and it suggests that we should assume that enslaved people were observing and understanding far more than their masters recognized. What should we remember about Hester and her 23 years of listening and documenting? That she worked in a kitchen positioned to overhear the Hartwell family's private conversations. That she was literate despite laws prohibiting enslaved people from being educated. And that for 3 years she systematically recorded the secrets and crimes she heard, including sexual exploitation, family separations, fraud, illegal slave trading, and admissions that slavery's public justifications were lies. That she successfully escaped with her manuscript in 1858 and published it in 1859 to 1860 as powerful abolitionist testimony. That the Hartwells and other slaveholders denounced it as fabricated, but that historical research has confirmed its authenticity. That her manuscript provided an insider view of slavery's operation that revealed the hypocrisy and corruption of supposedly respectable elite families. That she represented countless other enslaved people who observed their masters carefully and who understood that the public narratives about slavery were lies, but who could not document or preserve their observations for history. And that her courage in documenting and publishing what she had witnessed contributed to the abolitionist movement and provides historians today with irreplaceable evidence about how slavery actually functioned from the perspective of those who were enslaved. What do you think about Hester's decision to document the Hartwell family's secrets and to publish them after escaping? Do you think enslaved people were morally obligated to expose their masters' crimes when possible? Or should we understand those who chose silence and survival as making equally valid choices? How should we evaluate the Hartwells' claim that the Hartwells' manuscript was fabricated when historical research has confirmed its authenticity? And what does Hester's literacy and her sophisticated documentation work tell us about enslaved people's capabilities and about the lie that they were ignorant and needed enslavement to civilize them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Hester's story of 23 years of listening and documenting challenged your understanding of enslaved people's resistance and demonstrated the power of preserving truth, even when doing so was dangerous, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to recovering the testimonies that slavery tried to silence, to honoring people like Hester, who documented truth at great personal risk, and to ensuring that the crimes and hypocrisies of slaveholders are remembered and never whitewashed. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that enslaved people were careful observers who documented their oppressors' secrets when they could, and that Hester's manuscript represents countless other stories that were never written down or written down but lost. Hester heard every secret for 23 years. One night she started writing everything down. Now you know what she documented. Remember her. Remember her courage. And remember that truth survived because she refused to let the Hartwell secrets stay buried.